As we come to Genesis 22, I want to remind you the background before we come to this point. In Genesis chapter 12, you read God called Abram out of the land of the Chaldeans. He said, "You come out." He obeyed, he came out. And after he came out, he made one mistake. He went to Egypt. And when he went to Egypt, they brought a girl from there called Hagar, a servant maid girl. And she became a kind of a very important character in Abraham's life. When God promised and said, "You will have a son through your wife Sarah." Sarah said to Abraham and said, "You might have a son through Hagar." Probably that is what God was saying. So ultimately they have a son. Abraham and Hagar have a son called Ishmael. And after Ishmael was born, 13 years later, God showed up again and said, "Abraham, I didn't say about your servant maid. When I told you the promise I gave you," listen carefully. When God gave a promise to Sarah and Abraham, there was no Hagar at all. God gave a promise and said, "You will have a son from your own body." And God meant it was Abraham and Sarah. But 13 years later, God reminded him and said, No, you will have a son of your own. Then God blessed them with Isaac through Sarah and Abraham. After Abraham and Sarah got Isaac, as these two boys were growing up, please remember that Isaac and Ishmael, they played together for some time. They were two brothers, they were stepbrothers in the same house. They were living in the same house. There came a point of time that Sarah said to Abraham, "This woman, this servant girl has to go." Because one day there was some mocking which happened. And then Sarah couldn't take it. She said, "This girl needs to go." Abraham said, "Okay." And then he sent this woman and her son and their son Ishmael away. After Ishmael is gone, after Hagar is gone, God shows up one morning and then one day and then says, "Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." I'll tell you about a place, one of the mountains of Mount Moriah, and you have to go and offer sacrifice. And who are you going to offer sacrifice? You're supposed to sacrifice your own son. And here the Bible uses the phrase, "your only son Isaac." Why is he called the only son? He's called the only son because at this point of time, there's only one son who's living with him. Also, the promised son was only through Isaac and Abraham, through Sarah and Abraham. That was Isaac. At this point, you find God also says, "Abraham, you love your son very much. You love your son very much. So therefore, he is your son, your only son, and he's Isaac, and you love him so much. I want you to do something. You have to go and offer him as a sacrifice there on the mountain as a burnt offering." I want you to read a portion and come back. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17 to 19. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 to 19. Here you find the role of the heroes of faith. Here you find in verse 17, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." We do not know the author of Hebrews, but Hebrews, in the role of the heroes of faith, you find the name of Abraham showing up. What exactly happened that day in Genesis 22? I want you to pick up a few words and then you will understand this very easy. There are three important words that you need to look at. There are three important words that you need to look at. Number one, the word sacrifice. Look at verse 2. sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. Number one, the first word you need to remember is the word sacrifice. Number two, the second word that you need to remember is the word burnt offering. The second word is burnt offering. The third word I want you to remember is, look at verse 4. Look at verse 5. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." He is now using a different terminology, and Abraham said to his servants, "We will go and worship God and come back." See, what God said to Abraham was not to worship. He did not say, "Go and worship me." What he said was, "Go and sacrifice your son." Are you getting it? God told him to go and sacrifice his son, and the way the sacrifice has to be, it should be like a burnt offering. Okay? It should be like a burnt offering. Very good. But Abraham, when he talks to the servants, he says, "We will go and worship," he says. We will go and worship. So there are three important words which are used synonymously in this portion. One is sacrifice, the other one is burnt offering, and it's also called worship in this context. Now, what is a sacrifice? What is a sacrifice? What is a burnt offering? What is worship? What my understanding is, when Abraham was telling the servants, he was trying to define the sacrifice that God wanted and called it as worship. He called it as worship. We will still further try to find out what he meant by worship that day, or what God meant by sacrificing. Now, what are the characteristics? What is the definition of a burnt offering? What should happen in a burnt offering? That's an important question, right? What should happen in a burnt offering? Please remember, the law was given to the Israelites much later during the time of Moses. At the time of Abraham, there was no law. But it's the same God who is giving these instructions to Abraham, and the same God who gave the law to Moses. Probably Abraham did not have the written format, but when God said, offer your son as a sacrifice, probably my understanding, my opinion is, God meant the same thing. So, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 1 and 1 to 9, you find the definition of a burnt offering. How should a burnt offering be offered to God? Look at this. The first thing that you need to remember is, the offering should be a male without blemish. If you read Leviticus 1 to 9, you will find these instructions there. The first qualification is that it should be an offering made of a male without blemish. Last week we saw how Jesus was tried in different ways, and he was proved to be innocent by the government, by the Pharisees. No matter who tested Jesus, he came out to be innocent. The second thing we need to remember is the animal is to be offered by the owner voluntarily. The owner must sacrifice it voluntarily. It should not be grudgingly. It should not be a forced thing. It should be a voluntary sacrifice. Number 3, the animal must be killed and the blood must be sprinkled. The animal must be killed and the blood has to be sprinkled. The fourth thing that you must do is, you must cut that animal into pieces. You cannot leave it on the altar. You cannot cut the throat. Yeah, you cannot just cut the throat and leave it. You have to cut it into pieces. When God told Abraham, you must offer your son as a sacrifice, these are the things that Abraham has to do to his son. Are you getting it? These are the things that are expected of Abraham in offering his son as sacrifice. Then the last thing you must do in the offering, the burnt offering, is after the blood is taken off from this animal, you must wash it. You must wash it, and then you must burn the whole animal. You must burn this animal. That is what is called a burnt offering. God told Abraham, and Abraham, you love your only son. I want you to do all this to your only son. You love him so much. You must do this. It's a great, very, very difficult proposition. It's a very difficult proposition. If our children are suffering, we cannot tolerate. We cannot sit back and relax and watch. We will jump up and do something that we may help the child. But here you see a very, very tragic situation that Abraham did not refuse. When he got the instructions, he said, okay, I will go. Now, there are certain things I want you to remember. Remember, and as we study this portion, what happened was, when God gave the instruction and said, you must sacrifice him on one of the mountains I will tell you about. See, God did not reveal exactly the GPS position and say, go to so-and-so place. He said, I will reveal it to you. I will let you know where you must be killing him. There are several mountains in that area. Near Mount Moriah, there are several mountains. God said, on one of the mountains, you are going to offer sacrifice. Okay, look at verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So, you need wood, right? So, he cut the wood. He cut the wood and then he set out for the place where God had told him about. And please remember, in this whole incident, Abraham did not even tell Sarah where they were going, what they were doing. You don't find Abraham going and talking to Sarah and say, I want to tell you something. When God told me, and tomorrow morning I'm going to take our son, I'm going to kill him. He never said that. She was nowhere in the picture. Implicit obedience is what you find there. Whatever God said, I will do it. Okay, Abraham started. Verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. He did not tell, we will go and worship, and he didn't stop there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, we read that Abraham had the faith that no matter what happens, even if I kill my son, cut him into pieces, wash him thoroughly, and burn him into ashes, God will raise my son back. Because God had promised, he did not say that even if you kill Isaac, I will give you another son, and through that son, things will happen. God said, it is only through Isaac that you will be reckoned. It's only through Isaac that you will be reckoned. And that point of time, you need to remember that Abraham had such a great faith. He had such a great faith by this time that he decided in his heart, and even if I lose my son, it's okay. God will bring him back to me. That's when, verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son. Would you underline that if you have a pen? He placed it on his son. All this time you see, they took the donkeys and there were servants. But now from this point on, the journey is only the father and the son. And father is not a young man, please remember. Abraham was blessed with Isaac. Abraham had Isaac, and by the time he had a son called Isaac, he was 100 years old. And please remember, Isaac was not a small kid. He was a young man. He was a young man. So Abraham, old man, took the wood and laid it on his son. He laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, now there's a conversation. It's a heart-wrenching conversation between the father and the son. I want you to remember what an innocent boy, this innocent man, this Isaac was, as he was traveling with his daddy. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, father, yes, my son. Abraham replied, The fire and wood are here. Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. To give such an answer, as they were walking, how much time they walked? From the house they started, look at verse 4. On the third day. So it is not overnight, they're not staying near a camp, they're not staying near a mountain, that they got out of the house and say, okay, let's go move up. No. They had to take a 3-day journey. They had to take a 3-day journey. On a side note, I want to tell you something. There are certain numbers in the Bible which are very prominent. Please remember, number 3 is quite an important number in the Bible. You find number 3 here, 3 days. Abraham and Isaac, they're walking. When Moses came to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, let my people go. In that context, you find Moses talking to Pharaoh and says, we want to take a 3-day journey into the desert and go and worship God. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus was under the earth right? So you find that the number is very, very fantastic. There is something interesting. Another number that is very important in the Bible is number 40. Number 40. If you see Moses, how many days and nights was he on the mountain? 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Right? So you find number 40 is quite an important number in the Bible. Number 3 is an important number in the Bible. Here you find that took 3 days. And also the Passover lamb had to be examined how many days? On the 4th day. You buy it on the 10th of the first month and then you offer sacrifice on the 14th month. This 3 full days you have to examine this animal. We saw this last week. 3rd day, the father and the son, they are moving. Nobody around. Now it's only father and son moving up on the mountain. And then the son says, Dad, we have everything for the sacrifice, but where is the lamb? A very smart answer. Abraham said, God will provide. And then, look at verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Do you see what happened now? The wood was on Isaac. Now, Isaac is on the wood. Do you see the difference? While they were traveling, the wood was on Isaac, but now Isaac is laid on the wood, laid on the altar. Isaac is a young man. He already asked this question to his dad. We have everything, but where is the lamb? When daddy was trying to tie him up, what we need to remember? Isaac did not run away. Isaac did not say, this is some kind of a trick that my dad is playing. He told me a different answer. He's brought me all the way away from my mom only to kill me on this mountain. He did not think about his dad like that. You find he was willingly ready to be laid on the altar. You know what we need to remember? 130 plus old man would not be able to, I don't think Abraham had that strength to lift this man and then lay him on the altar. I very strongly believe that when they were setting up the wood, I want you to picture this. They came to that place when God showed this is where you have to offer the sacrifice. And Isaac had the wood on him. And then Abraham said to Isaac, Isaac, you can let the wood off. Here we have to offer the sacrifice. They found maybe some stones. And then He said to maybe Isaac and Abraham, both of them laid this wood on the altar. And then this question is still running in Isaac's mind. Where is the lamb? My dad said God will provide, but where is the lamb? When they all were set, there was fire, there was a knife, and that's when maybe Abraham probably said to Isaac, son, you are that lamb. God told me that I must kill you. You know, the moment probably he heard it, it's my opinion, I'm just illustrating. Probably, I mean, if somebody else was in that place, probably you would run away and said, my dad tricked me into this. But Isaac was ready to be voluntarily slain. He was laid on the altar. Please remember the context. Isaac was Abraham's only son. Isaac was Abraham's very beloved son. There is another definition that we get out of this is, what exactly is worship? What is a sacrifice? What is a burnt offering? Is laying down that you like the most on the altar of God. That is the worship. That is your sacrifice. Worship is not just singing, raising hands, or singing some songs here. No. Our life has to be a sacrifice. You lay down your best thing on the altar. Abraham did that. When he lifted up his knife and was about to slay, God stopped him and said, Abraham, look at verse 12. Do not lay a hand on the boy. He said, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld me from your son, or your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. When you study this story, there are a lot of things that come to your mind. I try to put myself in Isaac's shoes and think like this. I don't think probably Isaac ever forgot what happened to him on the mountain that day. And I don't think the father and son ever told this to the mom. But I tell you, when Isaac looks into the eyes of the daddy, probably the whole communication, the whole scene comes back alive and says, Dad, you were ready to kill me. Father looking at the son would say, son, you were ready to be killed. It's a kind of a mutual admiration and say, wow, you were ready to obey God. But ultimately what happened was, God did not allow Abraham to kill Isaac. He provided a substitute. He provided a substitute. There are certain similarities between Isaac and Jesus. There are similarities between Isaac and Jesus. Isaac is a type of Jesus Christ. Whatever happened to Isaac, a lot of similar things happened to Jesus Christ. Let's look at them, what they are. Isaac and Jesus were both born miraculously. The birth of Jesus and Isaac was unique. Here is an old man, 100 years old. He has a son at the age of 100. And here you find Jesus born to a virgin. Never before heard in both cases. Right? Unique situation. The birth of both Isaac and Jesus was miraculous. Number two, Isaac and Jesus, both were offered as a sacrifice. You know, when Abraham was walking on the mountain with Isaac that day, he almost thought, I have lost my son, right? When he came out, in obedience, without telling his wife, taking his son, taking the wood, taking his knife, taking the fire, going all the way to the edge of the mountain, then moving up with the son. And as they're walking, even when the son asks a question, he didn't stop there and return and said, "Oh, my son, I want to tell you what I'm going to do, but I cannot do that. Let's go home." No, he never said that. He continued, he kept on walking. 3 days. For 3 days, almost, in the mind of Abraham, Isaac was dead. He did not know that he will come back with his son alive. He had hope, he had faith, but he didn't know how and what was going to happen. Abraham did not know there was a ram waiting for him on the mountain. He did not see that ram. The only thing he thought was, God told me to kill my son, I will do it. I don't worry, I don't bother, I don't care about the consequences. And here you find that Jesus and Isaac were both offered as a sacrifice. They were both offered in sacrifice. Number 3, they both were offered in the land of Jerusalem. On Moriah, on one of the mountains, is where Isaac was offered. I want you to turn with me to book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 3 and verse 1. 2 Chronicles, chapter 3 and verse 1. Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, the place provided by David. He began building on the 2nd day of the 2nd month in the 4th year of his reign. Now this is the same town, same place where the temple was built. And this is in the same place called Moriah. And Abraham offered his son Isaac on Mount Moriah. Jesus and Isaac both were offered as a sacrifice in the same land of Jerusalem. You see that? Of course, several years apart. Several years apart. The fourth thing that I want to remind you is Isaac and Jesus. Isaac and Jesus both carried their wood for the sacrifice. You see that? Oh, I mean, if you really hear some things and say, see what happened there was, he's carrying his own wood, doesn't know what's going to happen to him. He's carrying his own wood. Isaac carried his own wood, went on to the mountain. Jesus took the cross. There is a street in Jerusalem called Via Dolorosa. Via Dolorosa. In that street, there are 7 stations where when Jesus was walking, he stopped, it seems. And all the 7 places, there is a sign which says, Jesus stopped here on the way to go to the Mount Golgotha. There are 7 stations. And there is a beautiful song written by a Christian artist. He said, when Jesus was taking the cross and walking up Via Dolorosa, he was turning back to look and see if anybody was following him. He took his cross, he took the wood, and he was walking and he carried his cross. The 5th thing you must remember is Isaac and Jesus, both of them died on a mountain. They died on a mountain. When I say Isaac died, it means figuratively. Remember Hebrews 11:19. He figuratively died. So there you find both of them died on the mountain. The other thing you want to remember is that both of them were bound and placed on top of the wood. They were both bound. Remember Isaac to be offered as a sacrifice. They were both bound. I imagine when the father laid the son on the wood, on that altar, and he was tying down. It was probably Isaac who allowed daddy and said, Dad, it's okay. You can tie me. I want you to think about this story from Isaac's point of view. Go home read the same story and think about how it would have happened in Isaac's life. Probably early morning, daddy went and woke up. Daddy and mommy and sleeping in one bedroom. And maybe Isaac is sleeping in the other bedroom. Dad comes and says, Isaac, son, we need to get up. I want to take you out. Let's go. We have something to do. Dad, shall I tell mom? No. Let's go. He took him out. And think about what happened, what must have happened to Isaac as he was watching all these things happening. He did not know that he was being prepared for a sacrifice. But good thing is, Jesus knew why he came into this world. He carried his cross, went on to that mountain. He was bound and placed. And what happened to Jesus Christ? He was nailed to the cross. He was bound to that wood. I'm sure Abraham must have used some ropes, but Jesus was nailed. It was not just ropes. It was a nail that pierced his hand. It was a nail that pierced his feet. He was tied to the cross with the nails. The other thing you may need to remember is both willingly, Isaac and Jesus, both willingly allowed themselves to be offered in sacrifice. The last thing I want to remind you is, both were given back alive to their fathers. You hear me? Both were given alive to their fathers. When they saw the ram, when Abraham lifted the knife and was about to kill, and God said, stop, there's a ram. Abraham should loosen those ropes. I tell you, that must have been a great time of celebration. That father would embrace his son and say, son, how great you are, man. You are ready to be killed to obey dad, obey God. Wow. The only difference is, in the case of Isaac, God provided a substitute. But in the case of Jesus, there was no substitute. It was Jesus himself. But both of them were given back alive to their daddies. My dear brothers and my dear sisters, I want you to remember the kind of sacrifice that Jesus made for you and me on that cross. He died willingly. He carried the wood and he was placed on that wood only because he loves you. He loves you and me. I want to remind you that you need to go back and study. Turn with me to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6 to 8. Philippians chapter 2 and verses 6 to 8 is what you read here. Who being in very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of the servant, being made in human likeness. In verse 7, you find, I like this translation. It says, the Holman Christian and the New American Standard Version, they use a word called, he emptied himself. He emptied himself. When he says, I have nothing with me, he emptied himself and he humbled himself even to become obedient to death, the death on the cross. Romans chapter 8 and verse 32. Romans chapter 8 and verse 32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. He did not spare his own son. Abraham did not kill his son, but his faith was so much, but his preparation for obedience was so great, and he said, I will kill my son. I tell you, if that day God had not intervened, Abraham would have killed his son. But you remember Genesis 22:1? Genesis 22:1 starts saying, after this, God appeared to Abraham and tested him. He tested him. You see, God tested Abraham. What happened that day on Mount Moriah was not just for in the case of Abraham and Isaac it was a test. But in the case of Jesus it was not a test. He had to go through all that suffering on that cross. I want to remind you, brothers and sisters, there's nobody who can love you so much like Jesus Christ. There's nobody. Nobody. Not even your own parents, not even your spouse, not even your children. Nobody can love you like the way Jesus loved and showed his love. God did not spare his own son. I want you to go home, study chapter 22. Look at that sacrifice again from Isaac's point of view. There's so many beautiful similarities between Isaac and Jesus here. God said, you need to go and offer your son as a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Burnt offering. And Abraham says to the servants, I will go and worship God. Abraham, what is your definition of worship? Lay down my only son, whom I love so much, on the altar. You know, my only son. Would we love God more than anything in our life? We have some people right now sitting here who have an only child, right? An only child. They have only one son or one daughter. Just think about God. Think about Abraham. God said, you need to obey me. Will you obey me? And so much so that he said, offer your son as a burnt offering. Cut him into pieces. Wash him. Use the fire. Burn him to ashes. Abraham said, yes, Lord, I will do it. He said, I will do it. That's a kind of love that Abraham showed to God. He said, I will obey you, Dad. I will obey you, Lord. May God help us to remember that he has loved us so much and did not spare his only son.